Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're here today with Dr. Chuck Degroat. Chuck serves as Professor of Counseling and Christian Spirituality and Executive Director of the Clinical Mental Health Counseling Program at Western Theological Seminary in Holland, Michigan. He's also a faculty member for the Soul Care Institute. Chuck is a licensed therapist, a spiritual director, and author of 5 books, and retreat leader and speaker. He's also a minister of Word and Sacrament in the Reformed Church of America, having pastored in Orlando and San Francisco before transitioning to training and forming pastors. Chuck's latest book is titled Healing What's Within, Coming Home to Yourself and to God When You're Wounded, Weary, and Wandering. You can learn more about Chuck's books and all of his work at chuckdegroat.net. So Chuck, it's so great to spend time with you again, and many
Yeah.
congratulations on all the wonderful
Yeah.
things you're doing.
Yeah, it's been a few years. It's good to see you again.
Oh, it's been absolutely great to kind of follow your work, and you know, we have so many pastor friends in common
Yeah, we do.
because of
Yeah.
your work that is
Yeah.
really great to be able to see what they've done. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
so is there anything else that you'd like folks to know about you besides what I briefly touched on there?
Uh, I've been married for 30 years, and it's kind of fun right now. I've got two daughters, they're 24 and 22, but my oldest is a student now. So she's a clinical mental health counseling student at the seminary, which
Oh,
is kind of fun. So got her in class. She she's got her friends keeping track of how many times I cry in class and how many times I refer to her in class. So
ah,
um, so whenever I see students giggling or something, they're keeping track of things I say, Lord knows what they're actually doing, but
well,
uh,
that's got to be entertaining, if nothing else.
entertaining. Yeah, a little intimidating to have your own daughter in
Yeah.
class, but yeah,
That would be. That would be. Well, good
yeah,
for you for, stepping up to the challenge.
yeah, right, yeah.
So before we talk about your book, can you tell us a little bit more about your therapy work and your teaching
Yeah.
work?
Yeah, the therapy work has really been an organic part of my pastoral work for years. I did the dual degree in seminary. I was a pretty arrogant and certain seminary student who got stopped in his tracks by a pastoral counseling professor back in the day who called me out and named my impact and invited me to do some hard things, and I began the work back then. So I was 27 at the time and did a counseling degree. And so in both in Orlando and San Francisco, I started church-based counseling centers. And so my therapeutic work was always sort of part of my larger pastoral work. And so now the last 12 years or so that I've been at Western Seminary, I've my practice is now independent, and I teach at the seminary, but in my therapeutic practice, I see a lot of pastors. I see a broader range of people, but I think because of my pastoral work, my background, maybe I have some trust or credibility with pastors, and that's been a real gift to be in pastors' lives. And I also do these 5-day counseling intensives. I call them soul care intensives, where pastor will come to my office in Holland, and we'll spend 5 days together and go deep with one another. And that's a real privilege to do that kind of work.
No, good for you. I mean, I know Brian McLaren gets, asked questions by pastors, left and right about the future and everything, and he's been a big support for them. And I'm sure, you're
Yeah,
a need that is strong.
yeah, yeah. Well, Brian just tells them to avoid the oligarchs, and I do the. I'm kidding. I got to do an event with Brian a few years back. Well, it's been maybe 5 or 6 years ago now, when a friend named Brian Berghoff was running for office here locally. It
Uh,
was Brian McLaren, Kristen Dumais. I think right around the time Jesus and John Wayne was coming out, and
okay.
that was a fun event. I got to be I asked the questions, and then I just watched the fireworks go off after that. So
Well, that would be fun.
yeah.
That would be fun. They're both really smart people. I
Oh my
mean,
gosh.
Brian
Yeah.
McLaren and Kristen Dumais. I mean, oh my goodness.
I mean, I didn't get to ask very many questions because they were off to the races. They were
Ah.
they were doing their thing. So it was a great event. Yeah.
So before we get into your new book, could you tell folks a little bit about your earlier books?
Yeah, well, I did not expect to get published or I mean I enjoyed writing. I enjoyed the writing process, but the first book that I ever wrote was called Leaving Egypt, Finding God in the Wilderness Places. And I'd been teaching in a seminary, a different seminary program, part-time when I was still in ministry, doing some work around the Exodus story and helping students see their own lives through the story of the Exodus, and kind of doing what I like to do because I had one foot in the pastoral world and one foot in the clinical world, and I had a number of folks say, "Hey, you need to write that book," and I started chipping away, but it was a guy named Len Vanderzee. I don't know if you know Len. Len was an editor with, well, I guess it was a kind of a publishing arm of the Reformed Church in America and the Christian Reformed Church, and they called it Square Inch. They started a new imprint called Square Inch. And I was about 40 at the time. And he said, "Hey, we're looking for some folks like you, young, haven't published before, willing to take a risk with us. We're willing to take a risk with you." And it turned out to be a really beautiful process. Len
Hmm.
was a brutal editor. Like I remember he came back with chapter 4 and said, I don't know if I could say this on podcast, but he just basically said, "This is shit. You go back to the you need to go back to the drawing board on this one." But
Wow.
he was I was pastoring in San Francisco at the time when I was writing, and that was, yeah, I think, in the writing process, you discover you have something to offer in that way. Small little publishing company. I mean, not a lot sold. I mean, it's continued to sell over the years, but it gave me an opportunity to with Erdman's publish a book called Toughest People to Love, and then another book called Wholeheartedness, Busyness, Exhaustion, and Healing the Divided Life, which was, I mean, you and I are both. We both love Buechner. We both love Parker Palmer. There was a lot of Parker Palmer in that book.
Mm.
His work, Hidden Wholeness, was
Oh
really important
yeah.
to me, right? Um, and then I wrote a little Lenten devotional called Falling into Goodness, which was kind of playful in some ways, but I think in many ways represents uh, a deep sort of theological instinct within me. It's a Lenten devotional that uh, counteracts that that Lenten sort of sense of I've got to do this well, and I've got to give up all these things, and I got to get my life straight. Falling into goodness is falling back into your humanity, humus, your earthiness, your humility. So there was that book, followed by the one that actually did pretty well, called When Narcissism Comes to Church.
Mm.
And that was the last one I wrote before the one I just published. But so then, with that book, but most people don't know that I've written anything else, and all they
Oh.
want to talk about is
Oh.
narcissism. So uh, I've had to try to find my way clear of that a bit, I suppose.
That's
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
So as I mentioned, the title of the new book is Healing What's Within, Coming Home to Yourself and to God When You're Wounded, Weary, and Wandering.
Yeah.
So what led you to write that book?
Yeah, you hear a little Henry Nouwen in that subtitle.
Yes,
Uh,
yes.
yeah, that
Well, it
another.
sounds like your clinical work too, right? I mean, it
Yeah,
sounds
that's
like
right.
it's.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, one of the proposed titles I think was "Coming Home." But
Huh.
yeah, that book really, it emerged out of conversations around the narcissism work. So I've been involved in uh, this kind of work around abuse in the church for 20 years, doing psychological assessments, doing consulting for churches, and this larger reckoning within the church around the injustices of abuse. And um, well, the stories. Your listeners know the kind of stories that are out there, and some painful ones too. I think of Jean Vanier, who I loved Jean Vanier's work, and that was yet another one. But um, so after the narcissism book, in my clinical practice, people are wrestling with, I was wrestling with after my own firing from my first church as a pastor 20 years ago, wrestling with, well, what do I do with this pain? And
Mm,
so that's really what the book answers is what do I do with the wound? What do I do with the pain?
mm.
Um, what do I do with the trauma? Trauma is Greek for wound, right? And so what do I do with the ongoing trauma? This is what happened to me, but I guess the book really wrestles with, but what do I do with what's happening inside of me, that the lingering impact of the harm?
Wow. Wow. Well, our mutual friend, Jeff Monroe, recently, as you know, released a
Yeah.
book telling stories in the dark,
Oh yeah.
finding healing and hope with sharing our sadness, grief, trauma,
Back
and
there
pain.
somewhere. Yep, yep,
Hey,
yep.
so I mean, a
Yeah.
very, similar
Yes.
topic.
Yeah.
Because you and Jeff worked together at Western for several years. I know you
Yeah.
knew each other pretty well.
Yeah.
Did you guys talk about your two books in the
Yeah.
process of creating them?
I mean, I'm in one of those chapters, and he interviewed me in there, and that was a fun conversation. And Jeff's a storyteller, as you know, and a bit of a journalist. I mean, he was
Yeah.
interviewing and telling stories of people who've experienced all kinds of pain and navigated it. So he and I, yeah, we did talk, and I think this particular book really came out of this sense that I had that particularly in the spiritual abuse community, the survivor community, there are a lot of people in pain, and the book's not just for spiritual abuse survivors. So I'll just say that to be clear. But what I saw was a lot of people in pain who don't know what to do with that pain, and it's coming out all sorts of different ways. And if you're on social media as you are, and if you're connected to this community at all, you see the pain, and people are crying out in various ways for healing. And so I do think it's important right now in the midst of all this reckoning that's going on for people to, as I had to do years ago, turn inward and begin to do their own work. I know for me, we can talk about this if you want. Uh, After I got fired, I sort of stuffed it. Um, and I was a therapist. I mean, I knew how to do work, and I was a deep drinker of beer, and I wanted to tell my story, but I held a lot of it in, and it sort of backfired. I landed in the hospital in 2012
Mm,
with my sip. Well, I had gallstones, but my system was septic, and I ended up having to stay longer, and the healing process took longer. I think in large part because of the trauma, the undealt with trauma. So this is born out of my own story too.
mm.
Yeah.
Um, well, so, when I was doing work with so many new authors, I mean, one of the questions that always come up was, well, what do I write about? I mean,
Yeah.
everyone wanted, well, I mean, and they wanted to hear the answer of, okay, what are the publishing houses looking for, right?
Yes.
But I would always suggest them think about some aspect of pain
Yeah.
because it's so universal,
Yeah.
and there's probably a niche somewhere within
Yeah.
the general topic
Yeah.
that some people are like really, really interested in.
Yeah.
It gives you kind of a beachhead, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah.
Start
Yeah.
your writing career with a focus on that, right? And then you
Yes.
can grow it, later. But
Yeah.
I was glad to see your book and Jeff books and several others that
Mhm.
focus on that because I think it's continues to be an unmet need in the marketplace.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think an invitation to do that inner work that isn't 3 steps, 7 steps. Here's the solution. Here's the Band-Aid. There's a lot of that, and that's what I appreciated about Jeff's book too. Is
Yeah.
he as he enters into these stories, there's no quick way through. They're each and every one of the people he interviews. I mean, they're dealing with topics that are pretty wide ranging. That book, as you know, but there aren't any Band-Aid solutions to be found. So. I mean, I think there's a need there for books that take seriously the depth of the wound and don't offer trivial ways through. I mean, I think uh, there's a there's a way that I think about therapy. There's a way that I think about the healing journey. The way that I think about sanctification, transformation, things like this uh, that it isn't simplistic, but people have to be willing to do that work. And I think that this particular book invites people into that. But it's not going to be a book for everyone, particularly people who are looking for those Band-Aids.
Hmm. So I'm sure the book has elements of both, but would you classify it as more secular or
Yeah. Spiritual. I mean, it's very deliberately spiritual in the sense that I pivot off of three questions that God asks in Genesis 3. Uh, where are you? Who told you? And then that question, have you eaten from the tree, which I sort of translate as where have you taken your hunger and thirst? And those become really important questions for reimagining the Genesis story, seeing God as kind, curious, compassionate. I grew up with the Genesis 3 story as the great tragedy, right, of all that went wrong and how narcissistic Adam and Eve were and how selfish and arrogant and proud they were. But I've reimagined, I mean, as I've worked with the story over the years, I don't want to at all minimize their grasping and how we grasped, but I see that as a story of the serpent gaslighting them and deceiving them, um, and Adam and Eve reaching in the ways that we might reach for some sense of comfort, soothing, and then having that backfire. So I think it's a story that as I've read Buechner and Nowlan and folks like that over the years, I mean, they have a way of engaging scripture that's deeply imaginative, and they have a way of retelling the stories that breathe new life. And I wanted to breathe some new life into the Genesis 3 saga and invite people, particularly in the season of deconstruction and of cynicism, for all sorts of good reasons, to invite people to see God as maybe more compassionate and curious, which is maybe my favorite word, than they imagined.
Oh, very cool. Um, you're following in some great footsteps, in terms of adding fresh light onto topics that, we've heard for centuries, but,
Mhm. Mhm.
those things we've heard are, you know, a bit stale and I think a bit misguided in many
Yeah,
cases. So,
yeah,
so
yeah.
I'd like to read from a couple of the endorsements for the book.
Oh,
This one is
sure.
uh, author and spiritual director Tara Owens.
Hmm.
Says God's messengers come in many shapes, forms, and sizes, and I believe Chuck Degroat is one of them. So that is a wonderful thing for someone to say about your work. When you write,
What is she saying about my shape, form, and size then? I mean, I'm not sure what I think of that. That I'm
so
awkward?
well, I think she says that God's speaking through you. I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
do you feel that way? Are you conscious of that when you write?
Well, I mean, writers are often dealing with their own inner critic, right? And so my critic is quite loud. Um, I got a loud critic. Plus, if people know the designation, a highly sensitive person. I tend to be one of those more sensitive people, so internally there's some sense of, there's nothing about this that's helpful. There's nothing about this that's original. Um, so I did have this surprising moment when this is the first book that I've gotten to read for audio, an audio book. I had not
Good.
gotten to do that before, and I had a moment toward the end of that reading where I teared up even as I was reading, and I had this sense that this is really good. I think this is
Oh,
really
good,
good and
good.
helpful and lasting work, not just for a moment, or responding to a contemporary issue, but like a book that could have some legs and endure. And that felt really good. And there was, I don't say that arrogantly. I didn't feel that there, because I think there was very much this sense of boy, I've been dealing with a loud inner critic the whole way through, but there was some gratitude that somehow my words were formed with some really great editors, by the way. I don't know if you know Jillian Schlossberg at Tyndale, but she's
Yes, I do.
extraordinary. And maybe I should be talking more about her editing than my writing, because good editors make us look pretty good along
Yes,
the
yes.
way. Yeah,
That's true for everyone.
yeah, that's right.
Every offer I talk to, it says
Yeah,
they're thankful for, the great editor that they had in many
yeah.
cases. So
Yeah.
here's a portion of another endorsement. This one is from Dr. Dan Allender, therapist, author, and founder of the Seattle School of Psychology and Theology,
Yep.
who says, healing what's within invites you to address the paths and voices that have taken you away from your true home.
Mm.
So when I read that, I mean, the first thing I think about is Frederick Buechner's, writing about home,
Yeah.
longing for home,
Yeah.
remembering. So did his work influence you at
Yeah.
all?
Yeah, I don't know if Buechner ended up in the final manuscript or the final draft of it, but Buechner was certainly in the initial drafts. There's a beautiful quote about our finding our home and that deep sense of Eden within us that I used. That I'm not sure if it made to the final version, but Buechner, I think there are writers like Buechner now and Parker Palmer, others like that, that you don't even know sometimes how they're working in you, right? They've been in there for so long. I mean, I've been reading Buechner since the late 90s. I'm sure you read him a lot earlier than that, but I discovered him and reading Buechner, it felt like an antidote to my stuffy theological education that I got, and it my imagination, my vision for scripture, my own healing journey, my own capacity to know myself, all that opened up through his, well, it was the trilogy, the memoir trilogy, right? And then
Yeah.
the last one that he wrote too. And so, yeah, his voice is always back there if there's not a direct quote, right? Sometimes it's tough to sort of sort out, is this my voice or is Peter, is this Suman Kidd, is this Barbara Brown Taylor, is this who's speaking right now, Uh,
Well,
yeah,
I mean, we can't avoid being influenced by powerhouses like that.
yeah, that's right.
One. Number two, I think it's really good to be influenced by powerhouses like
Yeah,
that. I mean, all of us in terms of just our life journey, whether it's writing or anything else, um, have been incredibly life-giving to me, to
yeah,
spend time with people like the ones you've mentioned. So,
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
um, so what would you like readers to most take away from the book?
Oh, that's always a good question. I remember, with the narcissism book, I simply said that you're not crazy, that there's something about that particular book that validates some experience that you've had. But I do think for this one, that that readers would turn from, that thing that happened to them long ago in their past, in that church that they went to where the pastor harmed, uh, in that relationship that they were in that was abusive, whatever it might be, to the lingering wound, and begin to believe that there's some hope, that there could be some healing. Um, I think that's a big piece of it. I think the second piece would be that they're not alone in that, and that they might even discover that God is more kind and compassionate and curious than they imagined. And that piece feels really important to me. One of the things I say early on is that uh, what we know about trauma today is that trauma simmers in aloneness and in isolation. Um, Bonnie Badenoch is a trauma therapist. She says trauma is not events, it's aloneness with events. And so two people can go through the same really hard experience. The person who has support is less likely to experience trauma. And I really want people to recognize their need to be known, to be seen, to be known. I think that's part of you and I beforehand were talking about Buechner's Telling Secrets. That was a really important book for me, not least because I just had the sense that he, like me, held things within for such a long time that finally needed to find their way into the light. And through those three
Yeah,
books, Sacred
yeah.
Journey, right, Now and then Telling Secrets, it was like there was this gradual opening through all three. So it's an invitation for people to be seen, to be known, not least by God, for the sake of their healing. And I think I hope it accomplishes that.
Yes, yes. Well, it's a great book. I'm sure it will. Um, so, I mean, you just came out with a new book and that takes an awful lot of work. Are there any plans you have for future books or other
Yeah.
projects that you're able to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of wondered if I'd be done writing. I'm 54 and I in fact, when the publisher approached me, I said, what does the world need to hear from a middle-aged white guy anymore, really? I mean, um, and one of the things they said to me is that we always need to hear from someone who's lived some life and done some work and who has some wisdom to share, and so I don't have huge aspirations in terms of what I write, uh, uh, being a bestseller or anything like that, but I do have more in me. There's another one that I've been teasing around the edges a little bit, where I think it's a book that would take some of what I just wrote about, but make it accessible to people who are in roles of leadership. As you know, I work with a lot of pastors.
Mhm.
So I don't want to write a leadership book, right? Lord knows we don't need another leadership book, right? Um, Something that would deepen one's vision for maturity in those roles. I mean, I think one of the things that we've seen with this whole conversation around narcissism and abuse, and particularly in my work with pastors, is that you can have some competencies and gifts, and you can be a good communicator and inspiring, and lack character
Mm.
and maturity. And so this would be an invitation to character development, to growth and maturity and humility and curiosity. And I think that might be a different kind of book for leaders than some of those that are out there. So
Yeah.
I'm kind of teasing around the edges of that one right now. We'll see. I also have a desire. I don't do you are you familiar with The Critical Journey by Janet Hagberg?
No.
Uh, it's a book on the stages of the spiritual journey. I don't love the language of stages, but you've seen some of this in Richard Rohr in a book like
Yeah.
Falling Upward, where
Yeah.
first and second half of life,
Right.
Hagberg looks at really six distinct stages in the
Huh.
spiritual journey. I'm a big, I always say Saint Teresa of Avila is my favorite 16th century reformer. And in her interior castle, there are seven dwellings, and
Mm.
they're in some ways seasons of a spiritual journey. And I think I have a book in me that would tease out those seasons of the spiritual journey, because I think when we understand that, it can help put words to the deconstruction and disorientation and dark nights that we invariably have to navigate through
Mm.
for the sake of maturity. So, those are two books that I'm sort of dancing with right now, and we'll see what happens.
Well, good. Well, good luck with those. I think they're, great concepts and
Yeah.
will fill some significant needs for people. So
Mhm.
we'll look forward to
Yeah, thanks.
seeing those coming out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Chuck, it was really wonderful to get back together with you again,
Yeah.
and congratulations on all of your work. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Um, Again, the title of Chuck's new book is Healing What's Within, Coming Home to Yourself and to God When You're Wounded, Weary, and Wandering. And please check out Chuck's website, Chuck Degroat, ChuckDegroat.net. Chuck, thanks again.
Yeah. Thanks, Brian.